Back now, just like we were speaking before the break, Police Minister Senzo Mchunu says that fourth quarter statistics have shown an overall decline in crime, which, however, remains at unacceptable levels. Mchunu has released these statistics for the reported crime rate between January and March this year, with some categories painting a really grim picture of the country's ongoing battle, particularly against gender-based violence. Sexual offences reported across the country also remain high.
The fourth quarter statistics, as with the previous quarters, we are seeing a significant decrease in most crime categories when compared to the same period in the preceding financial year, 1 January to 31 March 2024. While we have not yet reached our ultimate goal of a crime-free South Africa, these figures confirm we are indeed making significant progress. We must, however, be clear-eyed about the challenges that remain. During this quarter, sexual offences, including rape and contact sexual crimes, along with commercial crimes, have shown increases. These are deeply concerning trends that demand renewed focus and urgent intervention.
Now, Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Cape Town, Professor Kelley Moult, joins us now for a little bit of a discussion, particularly when it comes to gender-based violence and rape here, Professor, if I may. I mean, do these statistics just show us the clearness of our ineffectiveness in the interventions that are aimed at both gender-based violence, femicide and rape?
Hi, thank you. I think that, statistics can be a little bit misleading. We know that what is reported to the police in respect of gender-based violence is only a small percentage of the incidents that happen. So there's a large fallout between, people that experience a sexual offense or domestic violence and the number of cases that are actually reported to the police. But the police statistics are important because they do provide a measure for us to establish on an ongoing basis what the trends are. Now, we might welcome a decrease in the number of reported sexual offences, and we might take from that the police are actually doing a good job, but that might be misleading. Sometimes when we see the police doing a good job in responding to gender-based violence and in particular sexual offences, we might actually expect to see an increase in the number of cases. And that's because of that wide disparity between the number of cases that happen, or the number of incidents that happen, and the number of cases that are actually reported to the police. So when we see that survivors have more confidence in the police, believe that their case will be taken seriously, when the police do a good job of recording cases rather than telling survivors they need to go to the hospital, or that it's not a good case for whatever reason, we might actually expect to see an increase in the number of reported sexual violence cases. So it's not easy for us to make the straight comparison, but certainly any increase is something to be concerned about.
Yeah, that's actually such an interesting way to really look at it, and something that perhaps wasn't as thought out. How then do we measure whether the interventions put forward by law enforcement are actually working?
So that's a good question. I think there's been quite a lot of research on the quality of the response by police to sexual violence. We know that in general, in terms of gender-based violence broadly, both domestic violence and sexual offences, the policing response leaves a lot to be desired. We also know that there's an enormous amount of complexity about the trauma that somebody experiences after having experienced a sexual offence, that also impacts whether they decide to actually open a formal case or not. Most survivors know the person who has offended against them. That adds into, the complexity of making that decision of whether to go to the police or not. Often survivors will have mistakenly bathed or showered or done something that destroyed evidence, which makes them believe that a case that they lodge at the police wouldn't be successful. So there really is many complicated factors that go into that big fall off between the number of incidents that occur and the number of cases that are reported by the police.
Yeah.
But the police themselves have a critical role to play in making sure that the charge office is a welcoming place for a survivor who does go to report. And that's the place that I really think that we can hold the police to account, that they do their duty correctly, that they give good information, that they don't try to dissuade complainants from laying charges, and they do that what is necessary to ensure a proper investigation takes place.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask about the role that all of those elements actually play, but you've just made note of it clearly there. I mean, what's top of list or top of mind then for you when one considers the kind of policies or resource allocation that should be put in place in order to ensure that that environment exists, that there are more people reporting, which means that it gets dealt with better?
So that's also a great question. We have very good legislation, both on domestic violence and sexual offences, but critically poor implementation of both of those pieces of law. And so what we also have the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide, which was brought into effect in 2023, but which itself has been criticized for poor implementation, a lack of political will by government to really make the 6 pillars of the National Strategic Plan actionable, for a lack of accountability mechanisms of how we hold institutions to account and perhaps offenders to account when they don't do what they need to improve the response to sexual violence. I also think that there's a number of critically absent things out of the strategic plan that supports the implementation of the legislation. So there's not enough attention paid to the provision of psychosocial services, to the availability of shelters for women who need to escape situations of violence, and those kind of basic mechanisms that do then eventually become a question of budgeting. I think researchers and activists around the country have long drawn attention to the fact that the response to sexual violence is not properly budgeted in Parliament.
Yeah.
But of course, response is also only one part of the story. We need to be doing much more to prevent sexual violence. While it's great that we have a top-notch response, hopefully eventually, we want to make sure that those offenses are actually not taking place in the first place. And that is unfortunately not the role of the police or the criminal justice system. We need to be thinking much more carefully about prevention mechanisms, about educating our young people from very young about how patriarchy feeds into sexual violence and gender-based violence, around roles of attitudes and behaviors. So in other words, teach people to avoid sexual violence rather than always simply responsibilize the police for a problem which is not essentially of their making. We need to be doing much more on prevention as well to accompany a good response.
Definitely a lot of societal help pretty much needed on this. Speaking of which, does that mean we also are perhaps short of things like safe houses, rape crisis centers, counseling services, all of those being of critical need as well?
Absolutely. I mean, in South Africa, we're very fortunate to have the Tutuzere Care Centers, which is an internationally renowned best practice model for responding to sexual violence. It incorporates police, prosecution, psychosocial services, and medico-legal intervention. Of course, those are mainly centered in large urban areas, which means that as soon as you move outside of those spaces, the response to sexual violence can become much more spotty. There's been a lot of push from organizations and activists working in the sexual violence space to make sure that we can expand that model or expand what would qualify as a sexual offense response service so that that can be more accessible in areas that are outside of the metropolitan areas. But there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure that that happens. Of course, much of our service provision relies on partnerships between organizations, larger organizations, very small ones as well, to assist the state in providing services, critical services like psychosocial services, like shelter and care. And much of that relies on donor funding, which, as you know, has become much more constrained in the current global environment. And so we need to think much more carefully about how government pays properly for the services that it asks NGOs to provide, but also to how we can increase the sustainability of that environment to make sure that survivors are not left without proper care when they need it.
So important. And you spoke about government expenditure, etc. In that segment there. And I just wanted to find out as well, sufficient political will. Is that something that also exists, doesn't exist, perhaps something we should be worried about?
So I think that's a really difficult question. I think that it depends very much person to person. My own work in courts and police stations across the country shows extraordinarily committed people who really do amazing things every day to make sure that an overburdened, underperforming system does the best that it can. So I think it's really important that we don't take away of the strength of the commitment that some people have to providing good quality care and services. But at the same time, our response does leave much to be desired. There are still far too many survivors that go to police stations or courts and confront staff from the criminal justice system who are unsupportive, who undermine the victim's testimony or their story, who try to define them out of the system rather than provide them with service. So I think that there's a lot to be done still there. When we engage with government around implementation of the gender-based violence framework, they always say that they are enormously committed, that this is a key priority. And yet I think that after 30 years of work in this area, much of the response that we see could be happening in 1999 when the Domestic Violence Act was first coming onto the scene.
Wow.
So I think we need to have some real conversations about how we improve this response. We need to make sure that there is appropriate funding and budgeting for the parts of the criminal justice system that have to do the work.
Yeah.
We need critically to make sure that the DNA backlog is resolved. And that the parts of the criminal justice system that need to do the critical work that feeds into a successful prosecution are able to do their jobs.
Professor Kelley Moult, Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Cape Town, thank you so much for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. Then, as we continue to unpack those crime statistics a little bit further, particularly as it relates to gender-based violence and femicide as well then.